Well, the Democratic Alliance, the party itself, has refused to comment on this latest development. We'll keep abreast on that particular story. But for more on this story and other stories here in South Africa, I'm now joined in studio by the Director of Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird. William, let's start with that. Welcome, first of all. Thanks for joining us. Let's start with that Bell Pottinger story, because it's just broken. They've been booted out of the UK PR body that kind of houses them. And I suppose it raises questions about all the way down the chain, from PR to where it becomes news, where it actually becomes, some might even say, a treasonous act of fomenting division in a country and in a foreign state. I mean, that is tales of, you know.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. But exceptionally good news.
So what is your take, though, about where PR starts, ends, and news begins and ends? Because PR's job is to feed the media, and the media's job is to take this news and disseminate it. And the PR firm could not have done what it did, whatever it's accused of, without the help of the media.
Yeah, and in fact there are various investigations, one published in one of our dailies today, demonstrating exactly how they went about this, that it was a very clear, well thought of, well conceived plan to shift discourse using social media, traditional media, in a way that would try and get people to not focus too much on one thing and instead to focus on effectively racial division and other elements. And you know, the thing that's really powerful about these is that there's always a grain of truth to these things. So to suggest that there's not an issue with race in South Africa, and indeed how many white people are still representative at the top of many of our JSE listed companies, would be to deny reality. But at the same time, to suggest that there's this sort of little group of people that sit together and plan these things, and that these journalists are sufficiently well organized that they could organize, you know, getting drunk in a brewery, is frankly to not understand how those things work. So it does suggest that there are very dark, insidious forces at work to try and shift.
Do we have a responsibility as the media? Because, you know, when this term white monopoly to capital started doing the rounds, I suppose the media in some ways were reporting what people were saying, but also at the same time we're adding to its usage. And before you know what's happening, you actually create a feeling in a society about white people, about capital, and you then put it into this whole minority cup.
So I think where it's particularly powerful, and what makes the public broadcaster in particular so much more important now than maybe it was previously, is precisely because there's these thousands and thousands of voices that you can hear and thousands of views. You need to be able to say, this is someone that we can view, that we can trust, that is credible, because they check their sources, they make sure that what they're putting out is verifiable, that it's accurate, and we can explain to everyone the provenance of our information that we get. The moment you start to do that, that's how you start to distinguish what the role of media is against outside. Because of course media now, who is media? It could be anyone on the cell phone with a Twitter account, but of course here we're talking about respectable, credible news media. So, you know, the things that have been happening at the SABC have impacted on that as well.
So let's come back home now. Over the weekend, we saw Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa try and get a court order to stop the publication of an article by an independent media group. And so come Sunday morning, of course, everybody rushes to the garage petrol station to get their newspapers. And if they got two newspapers, they would have got two different versions of the same story. Yep. How is that? And then as a consumer, what am I supposed to do?
Well, exactly. So I think the first thing to do is to consume more than one or two. Make sure that you consume a diversity of views, and then make your own mind up about where you stand on those things. But your point illustrates, the moment one media damages and undermines its credibility, it necessarily undermines the credibility of all. So you're always going to get different takes and perspectives on news and on events. So media cover what happens in Barcelona far more than they do what happens in Sierra Leone. That tells us something about media's priorities, and this is exactly the same sort of thing. So the way you tell is you consume different media, make sure that you understand and ask yourself the question, who stands to benefit by using the kind of language that this newspaper did? The language they used in the Sunday Independent was vastly different to the language that they used in the Sunday Times. And you have to ask, well, why is that? And again, who stands to gain?
Were you concerned at all by the way the stories were told in those two newspapers?
Look, I think that the Sunday, I think it was, I think Mr. Ramaphosa must have known he was going to lose that case on Saturday evening. We've got a very clear precedence on freedom of expression, which is good. But that said, I think that the Sunday Independent did themselves no favour by having the editor, who previously had apologised in an editorial in his former employer to President Zuma, so you already sense that there's a bias there. Then some of the language used, but I think most importantly is they didn't say we verified the provenance of these documents. We were able to see that, yes, we checked the IP addresses, we checked this and this and this, our IT people looked at these. So you just get left with the says that we checked, we've seen these documents. So me as a reader, I'm not sure necessarily why I should believe you. Now, it may well be that they've done those things, and if they have, they need to explain them to us. So I think understanding journalism and its role in future is about saying we've done these and these and these steps to make sure that you as a reader or an audience or viewer or listener are left understanding how we came to the decisions that we've come to. Because once you start to explain things, anyone that's out there with a false agenda, they're going to be identified a lot faster.
We'll talk about the reaction just now, but I suppose the step before is deciding whether to publish or not. Is it in the public interest to know whether Cyril Ramaphosa, Deputy President of the country, may or may not have had affairs? He's admitted to one, but is this a decision? How do we make that decision? How do we get to that point even before we discuss a reaction?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that you've got to say, well, to what extent has he been doing something wrong, and where's the public interest lie? Is it of interest to the public? I have no doubt that it is, in the same way that whatever Beyonce seems to do is of interest to the public. But there's not a public interest there, right? And you have to make that clear distinction. You then have to say, well, are there any other stories that could possibly have warranted more importance for us to discuss? I think the Stats SA thing about the number of people living in poverty, living off 17 Rand a day, we need to unpack that. How on earth do you live on 17 Rand a day? The fact that Vuwani was shut down again, what on earth is going on there? I don't know these things. This is why you rely on Sunday papers to give you an insider view, to help you understand and give context and explain these things. And yet, instead of that, they chose to go with the Deputy President's having an affair or has had affairs or whatever, right? Had it been a case that it was directly linked to his performance, his ability to fulfill, that some of the women that he was allegedly having affairs with suddenly miraculously ended up as senior figures in public officials, then I think you can show there's a clear and demonstrable public interest. But on the surface of it, it doesn't seem that that's the case.
We've run out of time, but one last question. Can newspapers take a side? There's always this debate about media should be balanced, it should be fair, but it's starting to look more and more as if perhaps they're taking a view or taking a stance. And is it necessarily wrong? My personal view is that only the public broadcaster must be fair, and everybody else can do what they want.
Well, yes or no. I think that in news they still need to be fair. You can't, just because your paper has a particular political persuasion or otherwise, doesn't mean that you can afford then to skew the news directly in favour or otherwise, because otherwise you're going to undermine the credibility of other media, including the public broadcaster. So I don't think that it's wrong for newspapers, and we've seen them adopt political positions, but they must make sure that they abide by the Press Council, which talks about fairness, accuracy, that if you've got a position, you must be able to support it. If you're going to reveal this information, tell us where you got it from, on what basis you decided to publish. Obviously, you may not be able to name the sources, but tell us how we as audience can trust that what you're telling us is actually true.
I suppose in the times that we live in, the media has to be more and more careful about what they print, why they print, and how they print it. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, William, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.